Hi everybody, thank you for joining me on this talk this evening. My name is Mathew Morris. I'm an archaeologist at the University of Leicester, and during my career in Leicestershire I've been really fortunate to be able to excavate on three of our counties, well, Leicestershire and Rutland, the two counties, three castles, which is really lucky when you're an archaeologist, because most castles are scheduled ancient monuments. They're protected. You don't just randomly go around getting a chance to dig them up. So this was a really great opportunity to take part in these excavations, and it sort of led me to start thinking about all the castles in Leicestershire and Rutland and putting this talk together. So Leicestershire and Rutland, the two counties, they're not really known for their iconic castles, those picture postcard castles that you see in every sort of book on British history. And the castles that we are perhaps best recognised for, Belvoir Castle and the castles at Kirby Muxloe and Ashby de la Zouch, aren't actually castles, really. Belvoir Castle is a stately home. It's a Gothic revival stately home built in the early 19th century, and is actually the fourth building on the site of the original medieval castle, which there is no trace left today at all. Kirby Muxloe Castle, Ashby de la Zouch castles were actually their fortified manor houses. They're both built in the late 15th century, really when castles are going out of practical use and fashion. But ideas in castles, things like moats, towers, gateways, battlements and stuff, are still very fashionable as status symbols, and so they have the appearance of castles and the castle name. But from, as I'll define in a minute, from a point of view of a castle, they're not really that. And Ashby de la Zouch, of course, is also famous for being the site of the great tournament in Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. The only problem with that is that Ivanhoe is set in the 12th century and there was no castle at Ashby de la Zouch at that time. It is a 15th century construction. But so we don't have a huge number of widely recognised castles in the two counties. And these later 15th century ones, they're really more in line with these fantastic brick stately homes, these sort of very late medieval, early Tudor stately homes that you see elsewhere in the country, like Hurstmonceux Castle in Sussex and Oxburgh Hall in Norfolk. So they look like castles, but actually when you look at them, you can effectively, in Oxburgh Hall, you could climb through that window if you got through across the moat. They have illusions of defensiveness that don't actually have any practical applications. So perhaps then to start off with, we should define what a castle actually is. So there's lots of definitions and every one is ever so slightly different. So this is my own definition of what a castle is. So in my opinion, a castle is a large building or set of buildings fortified for defence against an enemy and usually sited with the aim of exerting dominion or control over an area. And that control of an area, that can be physical and psychological, and it could also be the control from the fixed control that the castle gives within its sort of immediate area of effect, you know, sort of the maximum distance of a bow shot or something from the castle walls. But also, of course, it could be controlling an area that its garrison can reach on horseback or something like that. So a castle differs from a fortified manor house then, in that a fortified manor house is a high status fortified residence capable of resisting an armed band, but not primarily built for defense or control. So it doesn't have that sort of that key element of the castle, is that it exerts a control over a wider area than just its immediate setting. The problem with this, especially when you get to these later 15th century buildings that are called castles, but are perhaps better in terms of definition described as a fortified manor house, is you'll quite often see this phrase "license to crenellate" popping up in literature. So license to crenellate is a modern term, catch-all term, referring to any document issued by the king granting the holder permission to fortify their property. And in the 12th and 13th century, when castles were important for control of areas, they were issued by the king to help restrict the number of fortifications being built across the country. So restricting them to trusted individuals. But as castles fell out of practical use, licenses to fortify your property became sought after as architectural status symbols. And by the 15th century, you could waive a license to crenellate around and not actually build a castle. So sometimes we get these sites where we've got a documentary reference saying they had a license to crenellate, but that doesn't actually mean they ever built a castle there. It's the document itself was the important piece in this instance. So when we look at Leicestershire and Rutland, then we have about 25 sites across the two counties that could be classified, could be classified as a castle or a fortified manor house nearing a castle, if you will. 3 of these sites, Groby, Leicester and Oakham, have all had recent significant programmes of excavation and research going on in them, and these are the 3 I'll be focusing particularly on tonight, because these are the 3 I've been involved with. A handful of others, the ones in yellow, have also had limited excavation work done on them or other programmes of research. But one of the biggest problems we have in the county is that many of the sites, the ones all ringed in blue, have little or no documentary evidence for them. So we have a physical site, earthworks or something surviving on the ground, but no real documentary evidence to help understand them. And in one instance at Ravenston, the one ringed in white, we have no documentary, well, one single reference to it and no physical site at all. So we very poorly understood site in Ravenston. And this has led to a fundamental problem with the interpretation of these castles. So often when you read the literature on these, that if you have a castle, the assumption is, especially if it has evidence of a motte and a bailey, so a big earth mound for a tower and a bailey, the assumption automatically is that it must have been built shortly after the Norman conquest in the late 11th century. And that's an assumption usually made with no actual historical or physical evidence to go with it. And this has led to a lot of problems. So you look at most of these castles in Leicestershire and you'll find somewhere probably someone has assumed it is a late 11th century castle. And one of these instances, as an example of why this is a problem with our understanding, if we look at Groby Castle. So Groby Castle has a large earth mound, the motte, and it sits within a large earth bank with a ditch, which is assumed to be the bailey, although very little of that actually survives anymore. And beyond the bailey, it still has outer earthworks, which could be fish ponds and outer baileys and other things. And the assumption, as I said, has been that this was a late 11th century motte and bailey castle built by Hugh de Gromanil. So he was the overlord of Leicester shortly after the Norman conquest. The problem with that historically, though, is that the castle isn't mentioned for the first time until 1174, when the Earl of Leicester forfeited it to King Henry II. So there's a 100-year gap in our historical sources from when people assumed the castle came into existence and when we know the castle was there historically. There was a small excavation of the motte carried out in the 1960s, and that perpetuated this assumption that it was late 11th century. So the excavation found within the motte the remains of what was interpreted as a building that predated the earth mound and therefore must have been a Saxon hall. And so they uncovered a wall with a door in it and what appeared to be an external staircase leading up to a first floor. So, and they interpreted this as this sort of classic rectangular stone building with 2 floors with an external staircase accessing the upper floor. And that the missing half of the motte, so the northern half of the motte at Groby is missing, was therefore interpreted as the slighting of the castle following a siege in 1174, shortly before the Earl of Leicester forfeited the castle to the king. All very well but very limited excavation effectively and very little documentary evidence to back that up. Time Team then did a big program here in 2011. It's series 18, episode 7. It's called The House of the White Queen. And their excavation refound that original 60s trench, refound that wall and the set of external staircase steps. But what they found was that the excavators in the 60s had got it completely wrong. What the excavators in the 60s had missed was that there was another wall on the other side of the staircase, and that the staircase, rather than being an external wall, was actually an external staircase, was actually an internal staircase going down through the thickness of the wall of a large tower into an undercroft. And that this wasn't a building that a Saxon building at all that predated the motte. It and the motte were contemporary, and that this was the footings for a substantial tower, stone tower. Time Team's programme therefore found no evidence at all of late Saxon activity on the site. It also found no evidence of the destruction of the stone tower in the late 12th century, so it found no evidence of a siege. What it actually found was that the missing bit of the motte was entirely down to post-medieval quarrying, and had nothing to do with any possible siege of the site. And so it was entirely possible then that the tower, and therefore the entire castle, was actually late 12th century in date, that it could conceivably have been built in or around 1174, and it could have replaced an earlier castle on the site, but it might not. It might have been a brand new castle. So in 1174, the Earl of Leicester fell out of favour with Henry II. I'll come back to him later. But he was restored to favour in 1189. So he fell out of favour with Henry II, but was back in favour with Henry's son Richard. And in 1189, he was restored to favour and had all of his castles returned, or most of his castles returned to him, including Groby. So it's possible that the castle was actually built when he got the site back, rather than being built before that. So there's this problem. We always assume that these earth mounds and bailey ditches, earth ramparts, are late 11th century castles, and they're not always the case. In fact, the more we excavate, the more we quite often find that they're later than that. So when we do look at what late 11th century castles we might have in Leicestershire, then we have 6. 2 we can be very certain about. We've got Leicester Castle and Oakham Castle. The very first castle built in Leicestershire was at Leicester, when William I built a castle in the town around about 1068, as he moved north through the Midlands to suppress the northern Saxon earls. And then Oakham Castle was built around about 1075, when the manor of Oakham reverted back to the crown from its previous owner. And there's 4 other castles in the county: Hinckley, Hallerton, Mount Sorrel and Belvoir, which are probably all late 11th century as well. They're not as certain as Leicester and Oakham, but we can be reasonably convinced with these ones. They were all owned by very close companions of William the Conqueror, and so it stands to reason that they were probably late 11th century in construction. So if we look at Leicester then, so we know that Leicester, as the king moved through Leicester, he gave governance of the town to Hugh de Grandmailnil. And in either Hugh built the castle on behalf of the king, or the king had built the castle and then granted it to Hugh. That castle then, with the de Grandmailnil inheritance, then passed down to the Count of Moulins, Robert, Count of Moulins, who became in 1107 the first Earl of Leicester. And it's really the Earl, as when they became Earls of Leicester, then that the castle stops being a royal castle effectively and becomes the seat of the Earls of Leicester. The Earldom of Leicester later merges with the Earldom of Lancaster to become the Dukedom of Lancaster, and then afterwards, so it becomes really the centre of the Lancastrian dynasty as well, Leicester is. So it's a major important castle in the site, in the nation's history really. It was and very little of it survives today, although remarkably more than you would sort of think walking through the site survives. So Leicester, it seems to be a classic Motte and Bailey castle. So you've got this large earth mound, which would have originally had a timber tower on the top, and then the foot of the mound you have this sort of kidney-shaped earth bailey with an earth rampart with a timber palisade, and then lots of timber buildings inside of it. The only thing that survives that is visible of that late 11th century castle today is the motte, the earth mound. It's 30 metres in diameter and it still survives to a height of 9 metres, although it has been, the top was cut off in the 18th or 19th century to make it wide enough to put a bowling green on top. So it has lost the top some height, but it's still there. We also, during excavations around the castle site, have found evidence of the original, the 11th century ditch surrounding the bailey particularly, and that's been found to be 10 metres wide and 5 metres deep, where we've been able to actually look at the full width and depth of the ditch. And this castle is definitely sited with that idea of control or dominion in mind. So it was built in the southwest corner of the walled Saxon town. So the walled town was the Roman walled town that had the Saxon settlement in its core. The Saxon settlement is along the high street in the area circled, sort of highlighted orange. By placing the castle in the southwest corner, it's sort of, you have the river protecting it along one side, but also it's in an area that can dominate the road from the south, so the road from London, and also the river crossing. So the red dotted line circle there sort of represents the effective physical control that the castle would exert over the area around it. So effectively bow shot from the castle walls could sort of cover that area. So you could sort of protect and stop people moving through that area without leaving the castle. Anything beyond that, and you'd have to leave the castle to exert the control. So it protects that river crossing, or controls the river crossing, of course, is more likely. So the castle site still survives today. It is a scheduled ancient monument. It's in the heart of Leicester. People tend to forget it's there because it's the other side of the Inner Relief Road, and it's the other side of the shopping centre, and sort of people, unless you're walking through it from one side of the town to the other, you don't often go through it unless you're going specifically to it. But there's quite a lot still surviving, and we can trace the earth motte still survives, and we can trace through excavations the sort of the extent of the bailey ditch, giving us an idea of its size. And within the castle area, we've still got some of its earlier stone buildings as well. The mid-12th century Great Hall still survives, and the early 12th century, or elements of the early 12th century castle chapel, Mary de Castro, still survives as well. So Mary de Castro is the earliest stone building to survive on the site. It was founded in the early 12th century, so around about 1107, by the first Earl of Leicester, as a collegiate chapel within the grounds of the castle. And eventually it grew to be a large collegiate church, and later became a parish church as well. And more significantly, whilst it doesn't look it from the outside, the Great Hall, the stone Great Hall, still survives as well. So this was built by the second Earl of Leicester in around about somewhere between sort of 1137 and 1162. So that's what tree rink dating from the timbers within the building tell us, that the trees were felled sometime between 1137 and 1162, which makes it the oldest surviving aisle and bay built timber hall in Britain, although it doesn't look it because it's been extensively repaired and reworked since to reflect its later use, post-medieval use, as a courthouse. And you can sort of see all of that use when you look at the northern gable wall. So in the centre, the sort of the nave of the hall, you can see the original 12th century stonework. It was re-roofed in the 16th century. You have a blocked up 14th century door as well. It was re-roofed in the 16th century. The eastern aisle was rebuilt in the late 17th century, replacing the sort of the lower timber roof, and then the western aisle was completely rebuilt, and a second floor was added in the mid-19th century as well, and then again the windows being replaced in the 19th century and so forth. So it's been extensively altered, but at its core, hidden behind all this sort of later brickwork, many of those original sort of early to mid 12th century timber elements of the halls still survive. So the southern gable wall still has its arched and chevron decorated windows from the Norman windows, and built within the sort of the later plasterwork, where the hall has been sort of subdivided down into smaller rooms. You've still got the arcade posts of that 12th century hall surviving. So The photograph bottom right is showing the sort of the top of the arcade post as it, where it's just been cut off to make way for the later 16th century roof. And if you crawl down into the underfloor heating ducts, you find the bottom of the arcade post still sitting on its padstone, surrounded by the Victorian brickwork of the underfloor heating. So a lot of this still survives. And recently, in 2016, the Great Hall was refurbished, allowing us a rare opportunity to actually carry out some excavation work inside the hall. So all the 19th and 20th century court furniture and floors and rotting timber floors, concrete floors signed 1980, etc. were ripped out, which gave us the very first chance to look at what was underneath the Great Hall. And we found this sequence of floor surfaces, starting with the bedding for the late 17th century floor in the east aisle. And in the nave itself, we found two sets of medieval floors. We also, as the sort of the timber panelling of the court furniture was removed, we found evidence of brick, that blocked 14th century arch in the north aisle, the north gable wall, sorry. And all of this evidence has actually sort of fundamentally altered our understanding of the hall. So we've always assumed previously that the north end of the hall, so the area of this photograph, was actually the service end of, the high end of the hall, sorry, where the Lord would have sat for dinner, and that anything to the buildings to the north of the Great Hall would have been the solar block and the Lord's other buildings, guest lodges and so forth, the state rooms of the castle. But these excavations have actually sort of fundamentally flipped it round. So we now think at its height, and this is what we think the castle would have looked like in the sort of 15th century at its peak, the Great Hall. We now think that the high end of the hall is at the southern end of the Great Hall. So we've completely flipped our understanding of the hall around, which has basically completely flipped our understanding of the entire castle around, which is going to have, we're still thinking this through, but it's going to have sort of knock-on effects on how we interpret the entire castle in the future. Now, Leicester Castle was one of really only two castles in the county that has been attacked and has withstood a siege. So in famously 1173, Leicester was besieged by the army of Henry II. So I sort of already mentioned the Earl of Leicester had fallen out with Henry II. So we have this description of the events from Benedict of Peterborough's chronicle in a writing sort of about 20 years afterwards. So in the same year, so that's 1173, about the feast of St. Mary Magdalene, so it's 22nd of July, Reginald Earl of Cornwall, uncle of the king, and Richard de Lucy with the army of England besieged Leicester and took and burnt it. The burgesses were given prior permission to leave with their own chattels and stay where they wanted in the land of the king until peace was on the earth, and then to return to their own lands. And significantly, the last line, but the castle at Leicester was not captured, gives you a good understanding of the castle's strength in the 12th century. So to put this in context then, what happened, in 1173, Henry, the young king, so he was the eldest son of Henry II, rebelled against his father. Basically, he's your original stroppy prince who thought his father, in some fit of madness, had decided he would make his oldest son a co-regent, and which is why he's known as the young king, and then basically gave him nothing to do. And so the stroppy prince rebelled, and a group of English earls across the Midlands, led by Robert Blanchemains, the third Earl of Leicester, joined the young king's rebellion. And this was a really significant problem for the king. So when you look at the map on the left, all those blue dots represent castles that sided with the young king against Henry II, basically cutting off the north of England from the south. Now, most of the actual fighting during this rebellion took place in France, in Normandy. And the Earl of Leicester was not actually present during the siege of Leicester. He was stuck and being besieged in one of his castles in Normandy. But this alliance of castles across the Midlands was a significant problem, significant enough that Henry II ordered his uncle, Richard Reginald Earl of Cornwall and his Prime Minister, Richard de Lucy, the Chief Justicar, to raise an army. And the significance here of this army, you see in its name, it was called the Army of England. Basically, this is the entire fighting force left in England is gathered. We don't have a lot of records for that army, but when you read the shire rolls for the various counties, you start finding evidence of it being assembled. So we know, for instance, there were at least 300 knights in the army. So if you've got 300 knights and you've got to add the sergeants and men-at-arms to that, you're probably looking at an army of 3,000 perhaps soldiers. We have at least one record of 410 archers and infantry coming from Shropshire alone. So this was a sizable army. We've also got 156 carpenters from Warwick, Nottingham and Stafford being sent to the siege, as well as a reference to an engineer from Northampton being sent to make machines for the army at Leicester. So that's a master engineer, a master builder of siege weaponry, being sent specifically to make siege weaponry to attack Leicester. The defence of Leicester then, in the Earl's absence, was carried out by the Earl's constable, the constable of the castle, a man called Anquetil Mallory from Kirby Muxloe in Leicestershire. And the town held out for 3 weeks until, it seems to be, when you read the chronicles, fire broke out and forced the town to sue for peace, basically. And the burgesses of the town were all fined and expelled, but the castle, Anquetil Mallory and the garrison retreated into the castle and carried on holding out after the town had surrendered. Until on the 28th of July, the Royalist army was forced to break off the siege. News reached it that a Scottish army was attacking the north and was besieging Carlisle. And so the priority became moving north to push the Scots back into Scotland. So a truce was agreed with the castle that would last until the end of September, and the army of England marched north to confront the Scots. The Scots, in the advance of the English, then retreated back into Scotland, so Carlisle was saved and nothing really happened. So the army of England turned back round again and marched back towards Leicester, and would have probably laid siege to Leicester again, but in early October, news reached it that Earl Robert had returned to England to try and lift the siege, or to relieve the garrison at Leicester. And so the army of England marched straight past Leicester and defeated the Earl at a battle in Suffolk, the Battle of Fornham, which the Earl was defeated and captured, ending it. The castle, though, quite happily carried on holding out and refused to surrender. And actually it didn't surrender until the following year, so it held out. Whether it was under siege the whole time is doubtful, but it carried on resisting the urge to surrender for a whole year. And in fact, Anquetil Mallory kept on, along with the constable of Mount Sorrel, a man called William de Deve, carried on attacking Nottingham and Northampton and other places during the year as well. They were absolutely determined not to give up until finally the Earl compelled his own castles to surrender. And he surrendered his 3 castles, Leicester, Mount Sorrel and Groby, to the king. Eventually, 3 years later, he was in prison for 3 years and then he was released, and Leicester and Groby were given back to him, but the king kept hold of Mount Sorrel after that, and it remained a royal castle from that point onwards, effectively there to keep an eye on the Earl of Leicester. So we find archaeological evidence for this siege. It's one of those rare moments where you actually find evidence of a period of history that was only 3 weeks in length. We have this wonderful description of the siege, again from Matthew Paris's chronicle, which has this little doodle of the walls of Leicester tumbling down. So he tells us, for the obstinate stubbornness of Earl Robert, the noble city of Leicester was besieged and overthrown by King Henry. When the wall of the city, wanting a good foundation, was undermined and the props that sustained it at length burnt, the pieces and fragments of the wall fell down, which even to this day, such is the indissoluble tenacity and stiffness of the mortar, remain fast and retain the bigness of sound rocks. And as we've excavated the town defences, we have found in the town ditch large amounts of fallen masonry, large sections of wall just sitting in the bottom of the ditch. And we also find them in the castle ditch as well, because the castle walls seem to have been knocked down after the castle surrendered in 1174. The castle's walls were deliberately knocked down, although the rest of the castle doesn't seem to have been touched. So, and we've also found along the river along Bath Lane in Leicester, we think actually found evidence of a cut through the foundations of the wall along the river that is probably one of these mine shafts under the wall. And so there is this tunnel cut through the foundation that is scorched as if a big fire has been in it, which is probably what we're seeing this description here. So you'd dig a tunnel under the wall, prop it up with wooden props, and then you would fill it with something highly combustible. Oil, dead pigs, where the fat would burn very fast and stuff. When you set light to it, and the heat would burn everything holding the wall up basically and cause it to collapse. So we do find archaeological evidence of the siege of Leicester. This had a profound effect on the castle. The castle was, after the siege of Leicester, was probably never really a castle again. The walls of the original Norman castle were demolished, the defences were gone, and beyond, from this point onwards, it really starts to morph into a grand, well, effectively a stately home for the Dukes of Lancaster. So in 1265, the earldom of Leicester passed to the Plantagenet Earls of Leicester, who become the Dukes of Lancaster. And from the mid-14th century, then, it became an increasingly luxurious ducal residence, which was quite capable of hosting national events and royal visits. So at least one national parliament was held in the castle. Numerous royal visits were held here. Henry VI was knighted in the castle, in the Mary de Castro as well, during a ceremony. And eventually, in 1399, it became a royal castle again. And really, when it became a royal castle, after a few years of sort of initial expenditure to bring it up to standard, it then started going into a long period of decline. But when we look at the shape of the castle post-siege, we see it sort of completely changed. The bailey has completely gone, and instead what we have now, the church has sort of left the castle sort of control and is now a parish church within its own churchyard. And in front of it is this large courtyard surrounded by the ducal residence. And the other areas of the castle have really morphed into gardens and other sort of structures. And not, by this point, it's not nearly in the 14th, 15th century, it's not a defended enclosure anymore at all. It is a fortified, it's not even really fortified manor house. It is a manor house, effectively a country house. Some of these later structures then do still survive as well. So we've got to the south of the Great Hall, we've got John of Gaunt's cellar. Not actually anything to do with John of Gaunt. It was built by probably his son Henry, who becomes Henry IV in the early 15th century, and it is probably the undercroft for the solar block, the early 15th century solar block, coming accessed from the southern end of the Great Hall, probably by a covered walkway linking the two buildings together. We also have the turret gateway, another early 15th century stone structure. And then we have the castle gateway, which is a mid-15th century replacement of the original castle gate. There was a fire in the mid-15th century in the gatehouse, which burnt it and the buildings adjacent to it down. And so they were replaced by this timber structure, which is, you know, high quality timber building, but it sort of shows you how the castle has moved on from being a fortified enclosure now. It's an entrance to a courtyard, and it's, you know, it's got a gate on it to keep the riffraff out effectively, but it hasn't got, it's not by any means a fortified enclosure anymore. Other buildings that were then added, so after the sort of it becomes a royal castle, really its domestic uses decline, but its civic uses remain, particularly its role as a courthouse, the Great Hall's role as a courthouse. And so Castle House was added in the 18th century, the brick building to the right of the timber building. That's the home for the judges who sat in the courthouse. And then other buildings that all linked with its role as the court were added in the 18th and 19th century. And you get Castle View, this row of 18th, 19th century buildings, which were all pubs and offices linked with the clerks of the court as well. So, and it's by then, as you see it today, as you walk through it today, it sort of had changed completely in character. If we look at the other four late 11th century castles in Leicestershire, then these were probably all baronial castles, and just to quickly look at two of them, Mount Sorrel and Hallerton, to give you an idea of that, they're sort of built for different reasons. So Mount Sorrel is definitely built for, to be defensive and physically dominant. So it's built on this spur of granite outcrop from the Charnwood Hills, which at a point where the River Soar narrows and moves closer to the high ground, and so it funnels the road from Leicester to Nottingham and Derby through this sort of bottleneck, which the castle completely dominates. It's also probably dominating a crossing over the river at Mount Sorrel as well. So this was, but it's a promontory castle. Again, sometimes you see it was called a Motte and Bailey, but it's not. It's using a scarp of granite and sort of reusing that to create this castle. And the bottom left image is what it may have looked like. It was built by the Earl of Chester originally in the late 11th century, but passed to the Earl of Leicester in the mid 12th century. Forfeited to the crown in the late 12th century. Repaired. It was the only other castle in Leicester, Leicestershire, that was attacked. It was attacked during King John's reign and Henry III's reign, at the end of King John's reign and the beginning of Henry III's reign. During the rebellions of that period, it was again attacked. There's been very limited excavation at this castle, though. We don't know very much about it. We've had some 12th, 13th century building rubble has come from what is probably the ditch, and finds. There's possibly stone walls in the Bailey, which may be the remains of a chapel, but again, it's a very poorly understood site, this. In contrast, though, so this is a really prominent, dominant position. It's sort of everything where you expect a castle to be to dominate the surrounding landscape. In contrast, and this sort of really highlights why castles, well, it really highlights that castles are built for lots of different reasons. This is Hallerton Castle, perhaps one of the most perfectly preserved Motte and Bailey castles I've seen. So you've got the lovely motte and tiny little Bailey. It's a very small little castle, about a mile north of the village in the valley, and it is completely overlooked by high ground all around it. It's almost hidden away in the landscape. But that isn't actually necessarily a problem from a defensive point of view, because all the areas that are actually higher than it are out of bowshot, and so therefore you can't actually attack the castle from these higher areas. But it's tucked down in the valley for some reason. So this was probably built as an administrative centre for a new administrative centre for a late Saxon estate. And that entire estate was passed from its last Saxon owner, a man called Toki, to a Norman called Geoffrey Alsalim, who then had a subtenant called Norman, who was presumably Norman the Norman, I assume. So it's completely overlooked by higher ground. So it's sacrificed its defensiveness, perhaps for accessibility and visibility. So the hedge where the mouse is behind the castle there is the original road to Leicester, which is the angle that the photograph at the bottom is taken from. And so when you're coming along that road, actually the castle would sort of be framed against the skyline as you came along that road. So it's perhaps built to show off something. So it's been built for other reasons than for perhaps psychological dominance rather than physical dominance. It's also perhaps built in the valley because it needs access to the water, perhaps. So limited excavations in the 19th and mid-20th century found evidence of iron production in the Bailey. So it might be that it was protecting some sort of industrial centre which needed the water, and therefore it had to be built in the bottom of the valley rather than on top of one of the nearby hills. The next sort of tranche of castle building then in the county is really in the mid-12th century, and it's all to do with the sort of the civil war, the anarchy of King Stephen's reign, and the civil war between King Stephen and his cousin, the Empress Matilda. So Stephen was the nephew of Henry I, and Matilda was the daughter of Henry I, and there was a large civil war that lasted 30 odd years during the middle of the 12th century. It was an unpleasant and unsettling time, and during this period you get a lot of unlicensed castles, and this is really the period where we first start getting documentary references to castles. So we already know of some of them were in existence by the late 11th, early 12th century. 3 new castles we know are in existence in Leicestershire before 1150. Castle Donnington, Whitwick and Ravenstone. And we know that because of a treaty between Ranulph IV, Earl of Chester, and Robert II, Earl of Leicester. So Ranulph sided with Matilda initially, and the Earl of Leicester sided with Stephen. which meant that they were sort of having this mini private war between the two of them in Leicestershire. They were using basically the fact that they were on opposite sides to have a sort of grudge match against each other. But in 1153, sort of 1146, Ranulph switched sides back to Stephen, which meant for a period up to 1153, they were in a sort of tentative truce with each other, and they formed this document that worked out, tried to demilitarize Leicestershire, basically. So the Earl of Chester held Mount Sorrel and Castle Donington, the Earl of Leicester held Ravenstone, Witwick, Leicester and Hinckley. The Earl of Chester also held Coventry. And this document mentions all these castles that are circled in red, which is why we know they were in existence. They were basically using it as a boundary to try and create this demilitarized zone. And the agreement came that the Earl of Chester would give up Mount Sorrel to the Earl of Leicester. In exchange, the Earl of Leicester would demolish Ravenstone Castle, was the agreement. But during this period, we've got a lot of other potential castles in the two counties, all these ones in grey, which may have also been built in the Anarchy period, and maybe what are called adulterine castles. So these are fortifications built without royal approval, particularly during the reign of Stephen. And these were really what the license to crenellate came in for. Henry II was really a big introducer of this idea of licensing castles to get rid of all these sort of illegal and unlicensed fortifications. Now, most of these are tiny, and they may not even be castles. A lot of them are just a simple earth mound, quite often close to a village church, or very close to sort of the centre of the village. So these are the ones at Gilmorton, Sharwell, Kibworth Harcourt and Shaxton. And it might be that they're not actually castles. It might be that they're something like a windmill mound or something. None of these have been excavated. If they were castles, they're probably better to be thought of as temporary forts, very quick defences thrown up and very short-lived. And certainly probably if they were castles, none of these would have outlived the Anarchy period. They would have all gone by the late 12th century. So in the late 12th century and the 13th century then, we get a few new castles added in, and then we start actually seeing now that the castles are focusing in the county, or the two counties, in two areas, in the west of, sort of northwest of Leicestershire and in Rutland. So new castles that are probably built in the late 12th to 13th century include Groby and Earl Shilton, Sorvey, Beaumont Chase, near Uppingham, Woodhead and perhaps Essendine as well. Although Essendine might be an earlier structure, it might be early 12th century rather than late, again not being looked at. These cluster then in these two distinct pockets, but when we look at where the medieval forests, the big medieval forests were of this period, we perhaps actually see why castles were being built in the county during this period. So when we look at them, we see that the castles now all cluster in or around the edges of these large medieval forests, which were all hunting forests. So you've got the Earl of Leicester's castles around Charnwood Forest and around Leicester Forest, the two sort of big hunting areas in for the Earl of Leicester. And over in Rutland and along the border with Leicestershire, you've got Sorvey Castle and Beaumont Chase are both in the heart of Leafield Forest, as well as you've got Rockingham Forest with Rockingham Castle as well. And it's likely that most of these sites, these fortified sites, these possible castles, were actually being built as hunting lodges. And because forests were notoriously filled with outlaws, perhaps the reason why you fortify your hunting lodge is to protect it. And forest law also has to be administered from somewhere. So there's the forest laws in these designated forests is different to the rest of the county, and therefore you need these administrative centres that can be protected as well. So a quick look at a couple of these then. So Beaumont Chase, or Uppingham Castle as it's sometimes called, is built on this escarpment just to the northeast of Uppingham. And it overlooks what is called Beaumont Chase, which was a hunting area. This was a royal hunting forest. It's sort of a Motte and Bailey castle. It has an earth mound which is in the woods, so you can see in the centre of the photograph, and then a sort of bailey. But again, it's more of a sort of promontory castle. It's used that escarpment and remodelled it to create this castle. It could be a 12th century adulterine castle again. It could have been built during Anarchy, but it's more likely to have been built as a 13th century forest lodge for this hunting area of Beaumont Chase. We certainly know it was under the tenancy in the 13th century of a royal forester. And we've had field walking across the Bailey has only ever really found 13th century pottery, and as well as some ironworking evidence as well. Again, it hasn't been excavated. The other castle nearby is Sorvey Castle, and this is again, it's down right in the bottom of a valley on a little promontory between the tributaries of two tributaries of the River Chatter, and it's this double platform, island platform, surrounded by what it would have been, with these tributaries dammed, a large moat-like lake, which would have been probably fish ponds surrounding it. It has stone buildings within it, and it first mentioned again in 1211, and it was probably a royal hunting lodge held by King John, which was then granted to successive foresters of Leafield Forest, and it's last mentioned in the early 14th century, so it perhaps was only around for 100 years or so. Its name is from the French salve, meaning dark isle, which I suspect gives you the idea of how deep down in the valley, in the woods it was. It was perhaps a dark and gloomy place, perhaps. But perhaps our best insights to castles of that sort of this late 12th, 13th, 14th century period is Oakham Castle, which still has this fantastic late 12th century Great Hall surviving, which sometimes people mistake as the castle, and no, the castle is in the castle. The castle is around the Great Hall. I was sitting here in the Bailey on that bench on the right one day when a group of kids walked past and went, I don't know why it's called Oakham Castle, why is it not called Oakham House? Mistaking or completely missing the fact that the hall sits within a massive earthwork, which is the castle itself. So this was another of the late 11th century Motte Bailey castles. It was built by William I in around about 1075. And then in the late 12th or the early 12th century, it was granted by the kings of England to Henry de Ferrers, to the de Ferrers family. And after that, it sort of passes down as a baronial castle through succession of different owners. Again, it still has a bit of its late 11th century earth motte surviving, and it still has its bailey, its 11th century earth rampart surviving, surrounding the bailey of the castle, in which still stands the 12th century Great Hall, which is incredible. And if you've never been to Oakham Castle and get an opportunity to visit, I really recommend it. It does have this weird obsession with horseshoes today, but when you get past the horseshoes and just look at the architecture, it is probably one of the finest surviving sort of late Norman, early high medieval Great Halls, still in Europe surviving. The architecture is amazing quality, and effectively it is untouched. It is pretty much today as it was when it was built in around about 1180. It does have some court furniture in it, but otherwise you can easily imagine how it would have been as a medieval hall. Other elements that survive then, you've got lots of earthworks in the bailey of the castle that are clearly the remains of demolished buildings. And you've also got some fragments of stone curtain wall, probably 13th century stone curtain wall, surrounding bits of the castle as well, which had been forgotten about till recently. So recently the castle has gone, since 2016, has undergone a major Heritage Lottery funded restoration. Up to then, the castle ramparts were completely covered in maturing vegetation, which was doing damage to the archaeological monument. So it was all removed to conserve what was underneath. And we'd actually completely forgotten that the castle was there and completely surrounded by a stone curtain wall in places still as well. It was so covered in ivy and trees, we just completely forgotten it was there. Our best description of the castle then comes in 1340, and this is what I mean by this gives us a really good insight into what this middle period of castles are, sort of the peak of castle building before the need for castles starts to diminish. So we have an inquisition from 1340 that describes Oakham Castle. And it tells us at Oakham there was a certain castle well walled, and in that castle was a hall, 4 chambers, a chapel, a kitchen, 2 stables, a barn for hay, a house for prisoners, a room for the gatekeeper, and a drawbridge with iron chains. The castle contains within its wall an estimated 2 acres of ground. The same is called the Manor of Oakham. Outside the castle is a garden, fish ponds and a moat. And this reconstruction drawing is based on this description, although it is a little bit out of date now based on some excavations we've been doing in the castle in the last few years. There have been various excavations in the castle over the years. The earliest were in the 1950s. John Barber excavated the area next to the castle hall and uncovered the surviving remains of the castle's service block and kitchen. So he found this. There was originally a lean-to building built up against the hall itself, which was probably the buttery and the pantry, and then this detached square building, which was the castle's kitchen, which was detached for a good reason. It was so that it wouldn't burn the Great Hall down if it caught fire. Other excavations, Time Team did a little program here in 2012. There was some excavations outside the castle again in the 1950s. And more recently, as part of this restoration of the castle, the yellow areas you can see on this plan are what we've been excavating between 2016 and 2019, of which the 2018-19 seasons were, which is areas 1 and 2 on this, were both community-driven projects where we had volunteers doing all the excavations. And they've uncovered some really significant buildings. So this is area 1 to the north of the Great Hall, the northeast of the Great Hall. And we uncovered here, there was an earthwork here that must have been the remains of a large building within the castle, and excavation found that beneath the ground and beneath sort of piles of spreads of building rubble were very well preserved buildings still surviving, which are going to give us some really useful insights into the castle and sort of how it was used through its history. So in this instance, we've got this large rectangular building divided into 2 rooms. It's about 18 metres long, it's about 7 metres wide. Not a lot of information about what was going on in its southern room, but in its northern room, it seems to have had an industrial function. There was a drain exiting through the doorway on the east side of the castle, and there was an early hearth in the room as well. And then a new earth floor had been added, and the building's northern end had been completely remodelled. So this was sort of the nature of the survival. You've got the footings of the walls still surviving. You've got collapsed stonework from the walls where they've been pushed over during the demolition of the castle in the 18th century. And then it's covered by a general spread of rubble and refuse. So the northern end of the building had been completely remodelled with these 2 large halves inserted into the north wall. These fantastically preserved keyhole shaped hearths that have got a scorched interior, so they've definitely been used for something involving heat, although the scorching has not significantly degraded the stone, so it perhaps wasn't high temperature activity like metalworking or something going on. So the reasons you sort of have these hearths in the medieval period, well, they're not ovens is the first thing we can say. There's no evidence that they had a domed structure. So it's unlikely that they were a kiln or an oven that would have been used for something like bread making or creating objects like pottery or glass or metalworking. What they're more likely to have been is like the image you can see on the right hand side of this medieval brewer, that they are the it's a stone hearth that would have supported a large metal bowl or tub of some sort above a fire, so it could be heated up. Brewing is one thing you could do with that, and we're sort of generally leaning towards this having been a brew house, but other possibilities could be dyeing, clothwork, maybe tanning potentially. Certainly dyeing, where you'd need to heat up water with the dye in it and then to fix it to the cloth and so forth. So some sort of industrial function. And then to the west of the Great Hall, our other excavation area has really excitingly probably uncovered evidence for the solar block for the hall. So the buildings here didn't survive as well, although still remarkably well preserved medieval archaeology, given the site's sort of history of decline and then demolition. Here we have a very complicated sequence of buildings going on. The original building, this one in red, is probably the original solar block for the castle. it has this very shallow square pilaster buttress on one corner, which is very typical of late 12th century architecture. You see it on the church here at Castle Hedingham in Essex. You also see it on the Great Hall at Oakham itself. So this building here is probably contemporary with the Great Hall. And it appears to have connected with a doorway in the north aisle of the Great Hall by a covered walkway. There was these two parallel walls with a floor in between, which heads straight from the corner of the solar block to the corner of the Great Hall. So the two buildings were detached but connected by a covered walkway. That covered walkway, yeah, so here you go, you can see that in the blue is these shallow walls, and then you've got this floor in between, and it's would probably be heading to a doorway or a set of stairs up to the first floor in the corner of the building. And then that covered walkway was demolished probably in the 13th or 14th century and replaced by new ranges of buildings. So the sort of the domestic ranges of buildings were expanding around the west end of the hall in the 13th, 14th century, and possibly a new covered walkway or a new veranda or balcony was added, connecting all the buildings together with these large padstones, which would have supported timber uprights for a porch or platform or staircase or something. So a lot of this is still ongoing work. We're still getting to grips with this. There's further buildings to the south of these buildings as well. It looks like they all surround perhaps a little courtyard at the west end of the Great Hall. But what they've done is we've effectively gone from a blank map of Oakham Castle. So previously, the only, other than earthworks, the only building we sort of really be able to pinpoint in the castle was the Great Hall, because it was still standing. But now we can actually start filling in Oakham Castle and all the buildings. And what we've now identified is that there's a very clear division within the castle. In the southwest corner seems to be all the high status buildings, the Great Hall itself and the solar block, the Lord's private residence, and other buildings that are perhaps guest lodges and to do with the residential side of the castle. And then in the northeast quarter of the castle seems to be surrounding a courtyard which has got a well in it, which is probably a service yard. We seem to have the sort of functional buildings of the castle, the workshops, stables, barns and everything else that you sort of see described in that 1340 description. The area in the northwest quarter, so far from the limited work we've done in it, seems quite quiet. So it might have been that this was actually some open space, perhaps garden space. And the area in the southeast quarter, it's difficult to understand what might have gone on here because you still have the moat around the motte disturbing a large area of that. And so it's sort of unbuildable on. But what the work on the ramparts and the walls around the castle has identified is that we can now positively identify that the castle had three towers, at least three towers projecting from its walls. So Oakham Castle up to this point has really been a castle that's sort of jumped between castle and fortified manor house, depending on what sort of state of knowledge we had on it. And up to the work on the walls, I was leaning more towards it being more a fortified manor house. It just sort of had a simple stone wall running around it. But now I think, you know, it's got this dramatic facade at the very least with these towers and a gatehouse. It's definitely back in the castle camp again, I think. And it doesn't dominate anything sort of strategic. There's no river, there's no sort of main road in the area, but what it does do is completely dominate the town and the marketplace, which was outside the gatehouse to the south of the market town in the area. So it's completely dominating the manor site, sort of this manor of Oakham and the Vale of Catmose, which is where it's sort of the valley it sits in. Moving on then, and we start to now see, going into the 14th and 15th centuries, castles start to decline in construction. We start to see fewer being built and some of them start disappearing. Sorvey and Beaumont Chase castles have probably disappeared by this point in the 14th and 15th centuries. New buildings that are being built at Ashby, at Bagworth, at Kirby Muxloe and at Sapcote, these are the buildings that are really better described as fortified manor houses than castles. These are starting to show desire for luxurious accommodation winning over the need to actually defend and dominate the area. and so you've got this sort of lip service to defensive elements like towers and battlements. They're becoming these status symbols rather than practical elements. And this is largely because by this point, by the 14th century and definitely in the 15th century, offensive weaponry has outstripped defensive architecture. So the introduction of gunpowder into siege warfare means that castles, modern defensive techniques and designs have not caught up with the power of artillery. And so castles have largely become obsolete at this point as practical structures. And so when you look at the things like the Wars of the Roses, for instance, in the sort of across the mid and late 15th century and across England, you'll notice it's all battles. There's really very few, if any, sieges during that civil war. It's all open conflict rather than fixed conflict. Whereas when you look back at something like the Anarchy of Stephen and Matilda's reign, and really there's very few battles. The bulk of that civil war was sieges of castles. There's this sort of flip from castles being more effective than siege weaponry to siege weaponry being more effective than castles by the end of the medieval period. And we can see, we saw it at Leicester Castle, how in its later years it's morphed into this stately home, and we can see that at Groby very clearly as well. When we look at the original Motte and Bailey Castle area, really Groby is better known for its 15th century manor house. So in the late 13th century, the castle was redeveloped by the Ferrers family into a manorial centre, which was then in the mid 15th century inherited by the Grey family. And Sir John Grey married Elizabeth Woodville in 1452. Groby, the manorial site, then the estate, was forfeited to the Yorkist crown in 1461 following John's death at the Second Battle of Alban. So Sir John Grey was a Lancastrian supporter. But it was returned to the Grey family after Elizabeth Woodville, John's widow, married Edward IV in 1464. So Groby is quite often better known as being the home of Elizabeth Woodville in her sort of when she was married to Sir John Grey. So we have the motte that survived. We can still sort of roughly trace the outline of the Outer Bailey from surviving bits of bank and ditch, but within that area, really the bulk of the things that still survive are this medieval manorial site that sits on top of the castle site, but really the relationship is coincidental in such. The castle wasn't there when the manor site was there. The castle had been demolished to make way for the manor site. So the only other ruin other than the motte within the castle area, this large standing bit of wall in the field next to the church, has nothing to actually do with the castle. This is actually part of the late 13th century manor house. And again, Time Team's excavations actually predominantly focused on this house. The episode was the House of the White Queen. And so this is the ground penetrating radar survey of the fields around within the Bailey of the castle, and we can very clearly see the red represents where wall lines were spotted under the ground by the radar, and we can see there's these ranges of buildings forming around a large courtyard area at the foot of the motte. But by this point there was probably no tower on the motte. It's just become a garden feature behind the manor house itself. This late 13th century manor house then had lots of additions added to it, which are called the Old Hall today, although of course they're actually the new hall in relation to the older manor house, which still stands and is predominantly of 15th and 16th century date. So these ranges of buildings, we looked at various ranges with Time Team, and there is me actually investigating one of these trenches for Time Team. And again, whilst the footings very well preserved, the floors and the foundations for many of these buildings are still very well preserved underneath the paddock, and that is what the area is now. And for instance, here we have part of the west range of the manor house with this fantastic projecting window or porch coming out from the west range. And Time Team were able to, in Time Team style, whiz up some very quick animations and reconstructions of what these buildings might have looked like. And so what we're here looking at, this is sort of cutting edge late 13th century architecture for, effectively a stately home, a late medieval manorial site. And the key thing probably here is this site doesn't appear to be defended. Whilst it sits within the bailey of the castle, that relationship seems to be coincidental. This manorial site on the castle site was not a fortified manor house, it was just a manor house. But we do have some fantastic descriptions of what was here. There's this dower settlement of Margaret, the wife of William de Ferrers, that describes the site in 1371 and talks about a great chamber called the White Chamber above a wine cellar with 2 further chambers above the cellar door. That, from the surviving architecture that we found and the excavations, is probably what that surviving bit of wall was on the south side of the courtyard, is the Great Chamber. It certainly seems to be the only building we've found so far that sits over an undercroft of some sort, which would be the wine cellar. So then we can go, if this is the Great Chamber, we can then start suggesting what some of these other buildings might be. So you've got a 2-storey building abutting the Great Chamber to the north. That must be this building here. We've got 2 chambers called the Tailory, extending to Sir Thomas de Ferrers' chamber, assuming that this description is describing a circle of buildings, which it seems to be, because then it talks about the old chapel with cloister to the south, which is talking about the courtyard. And we know the chapel is this area here. And then a house called the Colne House with the double gate. So that's talking about an entrance, probably with some sort of tower on it. We can sort of actually project what these different ranges probably were based on this description. So here we can actually quite reasonably link up historical sources with archaeological evidence. And then that building largely fell out of use by the 15th century and was replaced by a new, more up-to-date 15th century mansion house. And this is what survives of it today. It would have been much grander than this originally. This large tower on the left-hand side of the photo is one of what would have been a pair of brick towers. The other one is this stub over the garage in the middle of the photograph, which would have had a gateway running between the two, linking to buildings at the back. And then we've got these 15th century hall and crosswing and stuff. But in the 16th century, the Greys moved to Bradgate Park, so Groby Hall started to decline in importance as they moved to a new stately home in Bradgate Park, a couple of miles away. And so this sort of hodgepodge of buildings reflects that, that decline in importance, and the Greys only moved back here after their fortunes had waned and they gave up Bradgate Park in the 18th century. Just to wrap this up then, in the 16th and 17th centuries, castles and living in castles was really on the decline. When we go back to look at those sort of that 25 or so sites across Leicestershire and Rutland that have been used as castles during the medieval period, by the 16th and 17th century, only 7 remained occupied still. 2 of those, Leicester and Oakham, weren't inhabited anymore. They were still maintaining their function, their civic functions as a castle, because they were still being used as the county courthouses. And this is the criminal court that still exists. The Victorian criminal court furniture still exists in the southern room of the Great Hall at Leicester Castle. And again, Oakham also still has its 18th century court furniture in it as well, and 19th century court furniture. And those functions are really what protected these 2 buildings, the Great Hall at Leicester and the Great Hall at Oakham, which both at their cores are the finest examples of the architecture of their day, and some of the oldest surviving examples of architecture of their day have survived to this day so intact because they were used as courthouses. And in fact, Leicester and Oakham are the 2 oldest continuously used courthouses in Britain. We have dates going back to the 12th century when courts were held in these 2 great halls, and then they maintained their function. Leicester into the 90s, and Oakham Castle still symbolically holds a court in the Great Hall every couple of years to keep maintaining the record as well. So there was one last hurrah for a couple of sites. So in the mid-17th century, during the First English Civil War, 3 of the castles in Leicestershire, Ashby, Belvoir and Bagworth, or the fortified manor sites, were refortified and garrisoned by Ashby and Belvoir by royalist garrisons, and Bagworth initially by a royalist garrison and later by a parliamentarian garrison during the Civil War. And this sort of neatly highlights what happened to a lot of castles across the country. If we look at Ashby Castle, for instance, it was the home base for the royalist Henry Hastings, Lord Loughborough. He was the royalist commander, general commanding the Midlands for the king. And it and Belvoir were a crucial link across the Midlands from the royalist held southwest and to the royalist north. This vital communication corridor along the Trent Valley through the parliamentarian held Midlands. So its defences were strengthened. Excavations in the garden area at Ashby de la Zouch have found evidence for those extra ditches and fortifications hastily thrown up to protect the castle from modern artillery. The castle was attacked on several occasions by parliamentarian forces, but they never had any success breaching the defences, and largely settled for just bottling the garrison up. With a series of garrisons like Bagworth and another one at Calorton around it to sort of contain it. So the castle actually held out through the entire Civil War, or was held for the royalist cause through the entire Civil War, until it was finally surrendered at the end of the First Civil War on the 28th of February 1646, where it was initially used as a prison for prominent royalists, but eventually, as with many castles in Britain, the parliamentarian side, particularly Oliver Cromwell, slighted the castle to make sure it could never be used again against Parliament. And so the towers, the great towers at Ashby, were blown up around about 1648, I think it is, if I remember rightly. So, and really that ended occupation. Parts of the castle were repaired after that and reoccupied, but effectively it had ceased its function as it was intended to be, as that sort of fortified manor house. Other sites, like Kirby Muxloe, were never actually completed. So Kirby Muxloe Castle was never actually finished. It was started by William Lord Hastings in the late 15th century, and on his execution in 1483, I think, work stopped, and it was never actually finished and never inhabited, and just sort of remained a romantic ruin. And we've got various drawings from John Flower's artwork of it in 1826 to this photograph of it in the late 19th century covered in ivy shortly before it was restored. And of course it is part of owned by English Heritage today, or looked after by English Heritage today, and is open to the public. Which neatly leads me to wrap this up. We sort of put these talks together this season with the idea that you could sort of get out and explore aspects of them. So with that in mind, I've put this list together, and you sort of can go back and browse it at the end when the recording's online if you want. But many of these sites I've talked about today, and many of the ones I haven't had a chance to talk about, are actually accessible or visible. So I've broken them down. So open to the public. So English Heritage owns Ashby de la Zouch and Kirby Muxloe. Belvoir Castle is open to the public. Earl Shilton, Hallerton, Hinckley, some of Leicester Castle, Mount Sorrel and Oakham are all open access, with Leicester and Oakham also being, other bits of them being open to the public with more limited opening times. And then a lot of these smaller earthworks and castles, whilst not open to the public, are visible or sort of approachable from public rights of way. So you can get out and see them and explore them. Bits of Groby Castle you can see from the churchyard, for instance, and so forth.